something about this story doesn't add up. In the United States government's own records, filed carefully, stamped with official seals, and stored in federal archives, there are more than 14,000 names. Children's names. Ages listed beside them: 7, 9, 11, 13. Tribal affiliations noted in neat clerical handwriting. Dates of entry recorded with bureaucratic precision. But in column after column, where a date of return or release should appear, there is nothing. No discharge date. No record of a child going home. Just silence, stretching across the page like a sentence that was never finished. These children did not vanish in the dark. They vanished in the daylight, in full view of the United States government, under a program that was celebrated in newspapers, funded by Congress, and defended by some of the most prominent reformers of the 19th century. The official explanation was simple: these children were being saved. They were being civilized. They were being given an opportunity that their own communities, according to the architects of this program, could never provide. But if that is true, if this was rescue, if this was opportunity, then why are so many of the records incomplete? Why did so many children never come home? And why did it take more than a century for anyone in official Washington to call this what survivors had been calling it all along? To understand what happened, you have to go back to the years following the American Civil War, a period of tremendous upheaval, when the federal government was attempting to redefine itself, redefine its citizens, and redefine what it meant to be American. The war had ended slavery. The frontier was being pushed westward at a pace that left devastation in its wake. And the Native American nations that had inhabited the continent for thousands of years were being systematically dispossessed of their land, their sovereignty, and increasingly their children. By 1870, the United States government had spent decades fighting costly military campaigns against Native nations. These campaigns were expensive, unpopular with certain factions of the public, and increasingly difficult to justify to a country that had just fought a war in the name of human dignity. It was in this atmosphere that a different kind of policy began to take shape. A policy that would not fight Native people with rifles, but with classrooms. A policy that its founders described, without apparent irony, as a great act of mercy. The man most associated with this policy was a former military officer named Richard Henry Pratt. Pratt had served in the Indian Territory after the Civil War, supervising the imprisonment of Native warriors at Fort Marion in Florida. It was there, watching his prisoners, that Pratt began to develop a theory. He believed that Native people were not racially inferior, a position that put him somewhat at odds with many of his contemporaries, but that their culture was a cage. Strip away the language, the traditions, the family structures, the spiritual practices, and what remained, Pratt believed, was a person fully capable of becoming American. He summarized his philosophy in a phrase that would echo through decades of government policy: kill the Indian, save the man. In 1879, Pratt was granted permission to open an experimental school in a decommissioned military barracks in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The Carlisle Indian Industrial School became the template for what would eventually grow into a nationwide network of more than 350 federally operated or funded institutions. By the early 20th century, this network was enrolling tens of thousands of Native children at any given time, drawn from nations across the continent, from the Lakota of the Great Plains, to the Dine of the Southwest, to the Ojibwe of the Great Lakes, to the Cherokee of the Southeast. On paper, the system was straightforward. Native children, generally between the ages of 5 and 17, would be removed from their communities and sent to these boarding schools. There they would be given English names. Their hair would be cut, a deeply significant act in many Native cultures, often associated with mourning or loss. Their traditional clothing would be replaced with uniforms. Their languages would be forbidden. And they would be educated in English, trained in manual trades, and prepared, as the official literature put it, for useful citizenship. The federal government kept records. That is important to understand. These were not shadow operations carried out in secret. Annual reports were submitted to the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. Enrollment figures were tracked. Death registers were maintained. Superintendents filed correspondence with Washington. The paper trail exists, and it is extensive. And yet, when researchers began seriously examining that paper trail in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, they found things that the official narrative had never quite accounted for. The death rates, for one. At Carlisle alone, researchers have documented the deaths of at least 186 students during the school's operation between 1879 and 1918. Many of these children died of tuberculosis, influenza, and other infectious diseases. They were buried far from home, in a small cemetery behind the school, a cemetery that was later paved over during the construction of an Army War College facility and only partially excavated and restored in recent decades. Some of those graves had no names. Some of the names on the markers did not match the names in the enrollment ledgers. Carlisle was not unique. At the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School in Michigan, death records show children dying of what are listed simply as unknown causes. At the Fort Stephenson School in North Dakota, letters from the late 1880s describe children being punished for speaking their languages by having their mouths washed with lye soap. At the Genoa Indian Industrial School in Nebraska, an investigation in 1931, triggered by a whistleblower report from a government employee named Louis Merriam, found children suffering from malnutrition, inadequate medical care, and what the report carefully described as an environment not conducive to normal development. The Merriam Report, formally titled The Problem of Indian Administration, was published in 1928 and represents one of the most significant documents in the history of federal Indian policy. It was commissioned by the Department of the Interior, conducted by the Institute for Government Research, and its findings were, for the time, extraordinary. The report found that the average per capita expenditure on food at federal Indian boarding schools was 11 cents per child per day. Children were being used as laborers to maintain the schools themselves, farming, cooking, laundering, cleaning, under a system officially called the outing program, which was described as vocational training but functioned, in practice, as a form of unpaid or minimally compensated child labor. In some cases, children were hired out to white families in surrounding communities, living and working in those households for months or years at a time, with little oversight and no guarantee of return. The report's authors were not radicals. They were establishment researchers writing for a government audience, and they chose their language carefully. But even through that careful language, certain phrases stand out. They described conditions at some schools as distinctly below any standard of decency. They noted that in some instances, children who expressed a desire to return home were subjected to punishment or additional restriction. They observed that the correspondence between students and their families was, at many schools, monitored and in some cases censored. This last detail is worth pausing on. If these were schools, if the mission was education and uplift, why would anyone need to censor a child's letter home? Archives at the National Records Center in Washington and at regional facilities across the country contain boxes of this correspondence, much of it still unexamined by researchers. What has been examined tells a layered story. There are letters from children that read with an eerie uniformity. The same phrases, the same expressions of contentment, the same reassurances, as though they had been composed according to a template or reviewed before sending. And then there are other letters, some of them never sent, found tucked inside ledgers or folded into the pages of administrative manuals, that read very differently. One such letter, found in the Carlisle records and attributed to a Lakota boy believed to be approximately 12 years old, contains a single sentence repeated 3 times in English, then once in what appears to be a transliteration of his own language, "I want to go home." The letter has no date of transmission. There is no record of a response. When researchers began mapping the geographic and temporal patterns of the boarding school system in the late 20th century, certain things became visible that the annual reports had never emphasized. The schools were not distributed randomly. They were concentrated in regions where land disputes between the federal government and native nations were most active. The children taken from the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation in the 1880s and 1890s were removed during the same decades in which the federal government was systematically breaking up communal reservation land under the Dawes Act of 1887, a policy that transferred approximately 90 million acres from native ownership to white settlers and speculators over the following decades. Historians have noted that communities which lost significant portions of their young population to boarding schools during this period were also communities that found themselves less able to organize legal challenges to land seizures, less able to maintain the cultural and political structures that had historically governed their internal affairs, and less able to pass traditional knowledge and language to the next generation. Whether this was intentional design or a convenient coincidence of policy is a question that historical documents alone cannot definitively answer. What documents can show is that certain federal officials were aware of this dynamic and did not appear to consider it a problem. A letter from the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, dated 1886, notes approvingly that the removal of children from reservation communities was having what he described as a salutary effect on the willingness of adults to accept federal authority. He does not elaborate on what he meant by salutary effect. He does not need to. The historian David Wallace Adams, in his landmark 1995 study Education for Extinction, traced the ideological foundations of the boarding school movement through decades of government correspondence and concluded that the schools served a dual function, one educational, one political. Publicly, they were instruments of assimilation. But within the architecture of federal Indian policy, they were also instruments of disruption, severing the intergenerational transmission of sovereignty, language, and resistance. Adams was careful not to claim conspiracy where ideology and structural incentive could suffice as explanation. But he raised questions that official histories had long declined to ask. It is in the testimonies of survivors, many of them recorded late in life, some of them only in the final years before their deaths, that the texture of daily experience inside these schools becomes most vivid and most troubling. Mary Lyons, an Ojibwe woman who attended the Mount Pleasant Indian Industrial School in Michigan in the 1930s, gave an interview to a tribal historian in 1989, when she was in her 70s. She described arriving at the school at age 7, not understanding where she was or why she had been brought there. She described a matron who struck children across the hands with a wooden ruler when they spoke Ojibwe. She described lying in a dormitory at night, listening to the sound of other children crying, and learning within her first weeks that crying aloud would result in punishment. "We learned to cry quietly," she said. "We learned to cry so no one could hear." A letter preserved in the Nebraska State Historical Society, written by a Ponca man named Joseph Sherwood to the superintendent of the Genoa School in 1907, asks for information about his son, who had been enrolled 3 years earlier. Sherwood's letter is measured and formal. He was clearly aware that he was writing to a figure of institutional authority, but the desperation beneath the formality is unmistakable. He had received no communication from his son in 14 months. He had written twice before without receiving a response. He asked simply whether his son was well. There is no reply in the archive. The son's name appears in the Genoa enrollment register. It does not appear in the discharge register. It does not appear in the death register. It simply stops appearing. This is not an isolated case. In a systematic review of enrollment records from 11 federal boarding schools, researchers working with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition identified more than 14,000 students. The figure that opens this story, whose enrollment could be documented but whose subsequent fate could not be determined from surviving official records. 14,000 children who entered a government institution and, as far as the documentary record is concerned, simply ceased to exist. Some of these children undoubtedly survived, returned home, built lives that were simply not captured in federal paperwork. Record-keeping in the 19th and early 20th century was imperfect. But the scale of the gap is not easily explained by administrative oversight alone. In June 2021, the United States Department of the Interior announced the Federal Indian Boarding School Initiative, a comprehensive investigation into the history of the federal boarding school system. The investigative report, released in May 2022, identified more than 400 federally operated or funded schools across the country and confirmed the existence of marked and unmarked burial sites at approximately 53 of those schools. The report acknowledged that the full number of children who died in federal custody is unknown and may never be known, due to the incomplete and in some cases deliberately destroyed nature of the historical record. That phrase, deliberately destroyed, appears in the report without elaboration. It is stated as a finding, not pursued as a thread. The report does not identify who destroyed the records, when, or why. It notes the fact and moves on. This is the nature of the evidence that remains. It is full of doorways that open onto darkness. The records that exist raise questions that only missing records could answer, and those missing records are gone. Whether they were lost to time, to institutional neglect, or to something more deliberate is a question that the surviving evidence cannot resolve. What we do know is this. The system operated for approximately 7 decades, from the opening of Carlisle in 1879 to the formal shift in federal policy under the Indian Reorganization Act and its aftermath in the mid-20th century. During those decades, somewhere between 100,000 and 150,000 native children passed through the system. Estimates vary because, again, the records are incomplete. The schools were funded by Congress. Their operations were reported to the executive branch. They were covered, often approvingly, by major newspapers. They existed in full public view. And yet for most of the 20th century, they were absent from mainstream American history education. The textbooks that American schoolchildren read, the ones that described westward expansion as settlement, that portrayed native peoples as obstacles or as romantic figures of a vanished past, did not include the boarding schools. The children who had been taken did not appear in those pages. Their testimonies, their letters, their names in ledgers with empty columns where their futures should have been. None of it made it into the story that America told itself about itself. Why not? That is not a rhetorical question. It is a historical one, and it deserves a historical answer. What decisions were made, by whom, and through what institutions, that kept this chapter of American history out of the curriculum for so long? Whose interests were served by that absence? And what does it mean that the survivors who tried to speak, who gave interviews, who wrote memoirs, who testified before tribal councils and state commissions, were so rarely heard by the audiences that most needed to hear them? Perhaps this is simply the story of how large institutions process uncomfortable truths. Perhaps the silence around the boarding schools was not the product of any organized effort to conceal, but simply the accumulated weight of a society unwilling to look at what it had done. History is full of such silences, not conspiracies, but collective agreements not to ask certain questions, not to follow certain threads, not to open certain boxes in the archive. Or perhaps there is something more to examine. Perhaps the incompleteness of the records is itself a kind of record. Perhaps the 14,000 names without endings are telling us something that the documents with endings are not. What we know for certain is that these children were real. They had names in their own languages before those names were replaced. They had families who waited for them. They had knowledge and stories and ways of understanding the world that the schools were explicitly designed to extinguish. Some of them survived. Some of them did not. Some of them survived in body but returned home as strangers, unable to speak to their own grandparents, shaped by an institution that had been designed to make them into something they were not. The last of the survivors are gone now, or very nearly so. The testimonies that were recorded exist in archives and in the holdings of tribal nations that have worked for decades to preserve what could be preserved. The graves that have been found are being mapped. The children who can be identified are, slowly, being returned to their nations and their families. Some of them after more than a century in the ground of a place they never chose to go. It is late. It was always going to be late. But there is something quietly insistent about the way this history keeps surfacing, in government reports, in court cases, in the testimonies of descendants who never met the children who were taken but who carry the shape of that absence nonetheless. Perhaps it was nothing more than the brutal logic of an era that believed its cruelties were kindnesses. Perhaps the silences in the record are simply the silences of imperfect institutions operating in a chaotic age. Or perhaps those 14,000 children, the ones whose stories trail off mid-sentence in ledgers that no one was meant to read too closely, are still asking the question that no official record has ever adequately answered. Where did we go? And why did it take so long for anyone to look?